for 8 long years. A little boy in New York lived inside a wall of silence. His grandfather, a ruthless American magnate, spent fortunes chasing cures across the world. Every famous expert repeated the same cold answer: nothing to do. Just accepted, until the new nanny from a tiny Midwest town noticed a shadow inside his ear and made a choice that would either save him or destroy her life forever. What she pulled out that night will haunt you long after this story ends. The Whitford estate rose above the rolling fields of Vermont like an American monument carved from old money and older secrets. From a distance, the mansion looked peaceful, almost idyllic, with its white columns, towering windows, and gardens sculpted into perfect symmetry. But anyone who crossed its gates felt something different in the air, something heavy and almost unnatural. It was silence. Not the gentle kind found in libraries or quiet mornings, but the unsettling kind that felt built into the walls themselves. And for 80-year-old Aaron Whitford, born completely deaf, that silence was the only world he had ever known. Aaron moved through the long hallways with a softness that seemed to match the house itself. His small hand slid along the cool wooden paneling as he walked, searching for textures, vibrations, or anything that made him feel connected to a world he could not hear. He spent hours observing shadows on the floor, lights flickering through windows, or the subtle ways people's faces shifted when they thought no one was watching. Those tiny visual clues were how he understood the world, how he communicated, how he survived. His world was built on observation, not sound. His grandfather, Maxwell Whitford, was a legendary figure in American industry. Newspapers called him the Iron Magnate, a man who could bend markets with a single phone call. His empire stretched across railroads, energy companies, and corporate towers that sparkled over Manhattan like steel trophies. Yet none of his power meant anything inside the walls of his home. Maxwell was just a grieving father and a desperate grandfather who had spent 8 years trying to fix the one thing he couldn't buy: his grandson's hearing. He took Aaron to hospitals from Boston to Houston, then to London, Zurich, and Tokyo. Teams of specialists ran tests, scans, surgeries, and high-tech procedures. Each time Maxwell wrote another check, another doctor shrugged and repeated the same useless verdict: permanent, irreversible. Maxwell refused to accept it. He couldn't. Aaron was the last living piece of his son, Daniel Whitford, who had died in a plane crash that left Maxwell with a wound that never closed. Daniel had been everything Maxwell hoped to be: charismatic, kind, visionary. Seeing Aaron's silent world felt like losing Daniel all over again, day after day. So Maxwell fought. He spent millions, called in favors from senators and CEOs, flew private jets across oceans at the slightest whisper of a new cure. But each promise collapsed into disappointment, leaving Maxwell angrier, colder, and more determined. Inside the mansion, the staff had learned to move like ghosts. No one played music. No one laughed loudly. Conversations were short and muted, as if raising their voices might crack the fragile structure Maxwell had built around his grandson. Employees came and went, many unable to stand the pressure of working under a man whose grief controlled the rhythm of the house. They whispered about the tragedy of the Whitford family, about the silence in the hallways, about the small boy who watched everything but heard nothing. Aaron spent most of his days in the East Wing sunroom, a glass-walled space filled with bookshelves, toy airplanes, and puzzles. He liked the sunlight there. It warmed his cheeks and made the dust in the air shimmer like tiny stars. That sunroom was the closest thing he had to comfort. His tutors came and went, trying to teach him reading, writing, and structured sign language. Aaron understood, but he preferred the signs he made up himself, small gestures that expressed feelings traditional signs couldn't capture. A double tap on his chest meant happiness. A hand against his chin meant confusion. 2 hands pressed together meant safe. Maxwell rarely entered the sunroom. Whenever he did, Aaron's posture stiffened. The boy respected his grandfather, but feared him too. Not because Maxwell was cruel, but because his presence carried so much sadness that it felt like a weight crushing the air. Maxwell would stand in the doorway, watching the boy assemble airplanes or line up toy trains. His expression always carried the same mixture of love and helpless frustration. He wanted to speak to Aaron. He wanted Aaron to hear his voice, but there were no words for a bond, trapped behind silence. Despite the tension, the mansion wasn't unkind to the boy. The staff adored him quietly. They left small notes, snacks, or tiny wooden toys on the steps he liked to sit on, but they kept their distance. Everyone knew Maxwell's rules. No one was to interfere with Aaron's condition or attempt to help beyond their duties. Maxwell had fired an entire team of tutors, once for encouraging an experimental treatment he didn't approve of. Since then, everyone walked carefully, afraid of losing their jobs or upsetting the fragile world inside the estate. Still, Aaron noticed people's kindness. He noticed everything. He knew when a maid was tired, when a gardener was sad, when the cook was hiding a smile after receiving flowers from her husband. Aaron understood emotions better than most adults, because emotions were loud even when sound was absent. But sometimes he felt a strange pressure inside his right ear, a feeling that wasn't quite pain but wasn't normal either. He rubbed it often, wincing slightly. Doctors had dismissed it for years, claiming it was nerve irritation, nothing serious. Aaron believed them because he had no reason not to. But something dark had been growing there without anyone realizing it. On a gray Monday morning, Aaron sat on the wide staircase, arranging a row of toy cars into perfect order. He didn't hear the approaching footsteps, but he felt the vibration on the floor. He looked up, expecting to see a familiar housekeeper or security guard. Instead, a new figure stood at the base of the stairs, a woman he had never seen before. She was young, maybe mid-20s, with soft brown skin, dark hair tied back, and eyes filled with both fear and determination. Her name was Emily Carter, the new nanny hired after the previous one quit unexpectedly. Emily held her hands clasped, nervously, taking in the overwhelming size of the estate. Aaron studied her the way he studied everything, carefully, silently. She didn't look like the other staff members. She seemed unsure, out of place, too human for a house that had tried so hard to become a machine. Emily's eyes flicked toward him, and instead of avoiding his gaze like most adults did, she offered him a small, gentle smile. It was the kind of smile that said, "I see you." Aaron froze. People didn't usually look at him that way. Emily lifted her hand and gave him a tiny wave. Slow, cautious, respectful. Aaron hesitated, then raised his own hand and waved back. It was a small gesture, barely a movement, but it was the beginning of something neither of them could have understood at that moment. Something that would shake the foundations of the Whitford family, the medical world, and the life of every person inside that mansion. From the far end of the hallway, Maxwell Whitford appeared, his presence filling the space like a winter storm. Emily straightened immediately. Maxwell nodded curtly, acknowledging her but not welcoming her. His stern eyes shifted briefly to Aaron, then to the nanny again. "Follow the rules," he said, voice low and controlled. "And do your job." Emily swallowed but nodded. Aaron felt the tension twist in his stomach. He didn't need to hear sound to feel the weight of his grandfather's authority. But something about Emily felt different. She didn't shrink under Maxwell's gaze. She didn't turn away from Aaron's silence. She didn't look afraid of the boy. And for the first time in years, the mansion's silence felt like it was about to change. Emily Carter had never imagined stepping into a world like the Whitford estate. She came from a tiny apartment in Ohio, where the kitchen sink leaked. The walls were thin, and the idea of wealth felt like a distant fantasy meant for someone else. Her life had been a string of responsibilities she never asked for, but carried anyway. When her mother got sick and medical debt stacked higher than her monthly income, Emily dropped out of college and took work wherever she could find it. Babysitter, cleaner, night shift cashier, anything that kept the lights on. Becoming a nanny wasn't a dream but a necessity. She was good with children, patient in a way struggling people often become, and willing to give more than she had, but nothing prepared her for Vermont's cold air, the harsh structure of the Whitford household, or the suffocating quiet that wrapped itself around the estate like fog. On her first official morning, Emily woke before sunrise with nerves swirling in her stomach. She sat on the edge of her small staff bed, reviewing everything she had memorized from the employee handbook. No loud noise, no unexpected interactions, no emotional overwhelm, and above all, no interference with any medical aspect of Aaron's condition. The previous nanny had been fired for asking too many questions about the boy's hearing, and Emily could not afford to make the same mistake. Her mother still needed treatments back home, and Emily had promised she would find a way to pay for them. Losing this job would destroy everything she was barely holding together. When she stepped into the sunroom that morning, Aaron was already awake, sitting cross-legged on the carpet with a set of wooden blocks spread around him. Sunlight poured through the tall windows, illuminating his small form like he was sitting inside a glass lantern. Emily approached slowly so he could see her in his peripheral vision. When he looked up, she offered him a warm but careful smile. She crouched near him, pointing at the tower he was building, nodding with genuine admiration. Aaron blinked, studying her face closely, as if trying to determine whether she was another adult who would ignore him or someone who might try to understand him. Slowly, he added another block to the tower, and Emily clapped softly. He didn't hear the sound, but he saw the encouragement, and a tiny spark of pride flickered in his eyes. As the morning passed, Emily watched him with increasing fascination. Aaron wasn't withdrawn or unreachable as some of the staff whispered. He was observant, intuitive, and deeply aware of emotional energy around him. He understood feelings better than most adults she knew, but Emily also noticed something else. Something subtle but alarming. Every few minutes, he touched his right ear, not in a casual way, but with tension, pressing just behind the lobe, wincing ever so slightly. It was a gesture so small that anyone distracted would miss it. She didn't. He did it again during lunch, again while reading, again when turning his head too quickly. No one had mentioned pain to her. The handbook had described congenital deafness, and nothing more. Yet the boy flinched, as if something inside was hurting him. Later that afternoon, Emily was summoned to Maxwell Whitford's study. The room felt like a museum, lined with polished wood, old leather-bound books, and the cold presence of a man who didn't know how to grieve softly. Maxwell didn't sit. He stood behind his desk with a posture carved from decades of control. "You understand your responsibilities," he said, his voice heavy but measured. "My grandson cannot be over. His tutors follow strict schedules. His meals are planned by professionals. Your role is to maintain order, not innovate." The pause before that last word made the warning unmistakable. Emily nodded, assuring him she understood. Maxwell's gaze lingered on her. "My son believed everything could be fixed," he said quietly. "That kind of thinking is dangerous. Do not fill the boy's head with fantasies." Emily swallowed and kept her voice steady. "I won't, sir." He dismissed her with a stiff nod. When Emily returned to the sunroom, she found Aaron sitting on the floor with a small notebook. His head tilted when he saw her, and he opened the notebook as if he had been waiting for her. Inside, he had drawn an outline of an ear, his ear, and inside the shape, he had shaded a dark mass. Emily felt her heartbeat stumble. She looked at him, and he pressed 2 fingers to his right ear again, wincing. She signed gently. "Pain." Aaron nodded. "Long time." Another nod, this one slower. She flipped through the notebook and found dozens of drawings of the same thing, the same darkness, inside the same ear. A chill crawled across her skin. Surely doctors had examined him thoroughly. Surely someone would have noticed if something was physically wrong. But what if everyone assumed everything was already explained by the word death? That night, Emily tucked Aaron into bed. He clung to his stuffed bear, pressing it tightly to his right ear, as if trying to muffle an invisible pressure. She smoothed his blanket gently, but when she started to stand, he reached out and touched her wrist. His hand was small, warm, and trembling just slightly. Emily froze, then lowered herself again, so he could see her face. He pointed at his ear, then at her. then pressed both hands together, the sign he used for safe. The message was simple but powerful. I trust you. Emily felt her throat tighten. She stayed with him until his breathing slowed and his eyes closed, the faintest crease of pain still visible on his forehead. When she finally stepped into the hallway, she leaned against the wall, shaken. She wasn't supposed to intervene. She wasn't supposed to question anything. She wasn't supposed to notice what the doctors had supposedly already examined. She needed this job more than she needed sleep or comfort. But she couldn't forget the look on his face, or the way he flinched every few minutes, as if something inside his ear was pulling at him. Ignoring that pain felt wrong in a way she couldn't explain. A violation of the very reason she worked with children in the first place. She walked down the dim corridor back to the staff quarters, her footsteps soundless on the plush carpet, her mind churning. Emily sat on her small bed, staring at the wall as the weight of the day pressed heavily onto her chest. She tried to reason with herself. The specialists knew what they were doing. The boy had been examined around the world. This wasn't her place. She didn't have the training or the authority, and Maxwell Whitford would destroy anyone who crossed him when it came to his grandson. But another thought rose quietly, stubbornly. What if no one had truly looked? What if everything had been rushed? What if every doctor had focused on the diagnosis they expected instead of the symptoms they didn't understand? What if she was the first person to pay attention without preconceived assumptions? She slept barely an hour that night. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the drawings. The dark mass shaded inside the outline of his ear, the wince on his face. She wasn't a doctor. She wasn't a specialist. She was just a nanny from Ohio who needed a job. But as the morning light began to rise and spill across her room, she realized something she could no longer ignore. If there was something inside Aaron's ears, something real, something physical, then the boy wasn't just deaf. He was suffering, and if no one else was going to fight for him, then she might have to become the first person brave enough to try. The next morning began with a sharp bite of cold, drifting through the Whitford estate, the kind that crept down hallways and settled between the walls like an unwelcome guest. Emily wrapped her sweater tighter as she made her way toward the sunroom. She expected to find Aaron already awake, building airplanes, or sketching in his notebook, the way he usually did. Instead, she found him curled on the floor near the window, knees tucked to his chest, head pressed against the cool glass. His eyes were shut tightly, and his hand clutched his right ear with a desperation that made Emily's heart lurch. She rushed to him and knelt beside him, gently touching his shoulder. His eyes fluttered open, and she saw the pain in them as clearly as if he had screamed it into the air. Emily moved slowly so he wouldn't be startled. She placed a hand on her own ear and raised her brows in a question.
Pain?
Aaron nodded, a rapid, frightened motion. He pressed his palm behind his right ear again, wincing harder than she'd ever seen him do before. She glanced toward the hallway. No staff, no Maxwell, no tutors, just the two of them, and the heavy morning silence. She carefully signed, "Show me." He hesitated, biting his lip, but after a moment he turned his head and moved his hand away. Emily leaned closer, her heart pounding. She saw nothing at first, only the normal shape of a child's ear. But then Aaron tilted a bit more, and the early sunlight hit just the right angle. Something inside caught the light. It was small, dark, and deep. Not wax. Not skin. Something else, a shadow where there should be none. Emily blinked, leaning instinctively closer, trying to make sense of what she was seeing, but the angle was too narrow. Whatever it was lodged far inside the canal. Impossible for her to understand fully without tools or knowledge she didn't have. Aaron flinched, pulling away from the pressure of light. Emily pulled back immediately, reassuring him with gentle gestures. She wanted to say something comforting, something that would ease the fear in his eyes. But everything that came to mind felt like a promise she wasn't allowed to make. Her chest tightened painfully. Something was wrong. Very wrong. A soft tapping sound echoed from the hallway, the subtle rhythm of Maxwell's cane. Emily froze. Maxwell never used the cane, unless he was on edge or deep in thought. The heavy thought of it meant he was not in a forgiving mood. Aaron stiffened. Emily placed a soft hand over his, calming him, then stood as Maxwell entered the room. His eyes went immediately to the boy on the floor, then to Emily. Something about the scene sharpened his expression. "What happened?" he asked flatly. Emily stepped forward. "He's in pain this morning, sir." Maxwell's jaw tightened. "He has days like that. It's normal," she swallowed. "With respect, sir. It seems more intense today." Maxwell's eyes narrowed just slightly, like a shutter closing over his emotions. "His specialists warned me of this. It's nerve response. Nothing more." Emily felt frustration rise, but she forced herself to stay composed. "If he's hurting, maybe someone should look, Miss Carter." Maxwell's voice sliced her sentence clean in half. "You are not here to diagnose anything." The room went still. Even the air felt like it froze between them. Emily lowered her eyes, but not in submission, only to keep herself from saying something she would regret. Maxwell turned to his grandson and softened his tone. He bent slightly, placed a large hand on the boy's shoulder, and signed a simple phrase. Aaron understood. "You're okay. It will pass." But Aaron didn't believe him. Emily saw it in the way his body sagged. Maxwell didn't notice. Or maybe he chose not to. The moment Maxwell left the room, Aaron lifted his notebook and began drawing again. His pencil scratched quickly across the page, as if he were trying to capture something before the image escaped him. Emily sat beside him, watching. When he finished, he held the notebook up. It was another ear, another dark shape growing inside. But this time he had drawn something else. Tiny lines, radiating outward, almost like cracks in a wall. Emily felt a chill snake down her spine. She traced one finger near the drawing, her breath uneasy. "More pain." Aaron nodded. His eyes shimmered with fear. Throughout the day, the signs grew clearer. Aaron moved more slowly. He avoided turning his head. Every time he swallowed, his hand drifted toward his ear. Emily watched every detail, taking mental notes the way a doctor might, even though she knew she had no authority to act on any of them. At lunch, he barely ate. During his reading hour, he closed the book after 2 pages. When the tutor arrived for writing lessons, Aaron pushed the paper away and curled inward like something was tightening around him from the inside. The tutor reported it to Maxwell later. Emily overheard the conversation from the hallway. The tutor called it a behavioral low point. Maxwell dismissed it as fatigue. Emily clenched her fists helplessly. That evening, when the mansion quieted and the household staff retreated to their separate corners, Emily sat in her tiny room, staring at the wall. She couldn't shake the memory of that shadow, deep in Aaron's ear, shimmering under the sunlight. She tried to convince herself it was nothing. Wax, skin, maybe an illusion of light. But her gut said otherwise. She searched her mind for anything she'd learned growing up. Her mother had been a nurse for a short time before illness ended her career. Emily remembered vague terms. Blockage infection. Blockage. Infection. But nothing that explained the shape she'd seen. Nothing that explained the drawings. Nothing that explained the pain. As the night grew darker, she opened her laptop, sitting on the edge of the bed with her heart pounding. She typed keywords into the search bar carefully, almost fearfully. Children, ear pain, deep blockage, dark mass inside ear canal, misdiagnosis, deaf child, hearing loss obstruction case. Article after article appeared. Medical journals, studies, testimonies from parents whose children had been misdiagnosed for years. Most of them spoke about rare forms of debris, congenital blockages, hardened tissue, or foreign objects that became embedded without anyone noticing. And almost all of them described the same symptoms. Wincing, drawing, headaches, pressure, increased sensitivity. Emily felt her stomach twist. But none of those articles described something that had gone unseen by top specialists across 3 continents. Emily stared at the screen, her pulse rising. Could every doctor have missed something physical? Had they been so sure of the diagnosis that they simply stopped looking for anything else? Or, and this thought made her throat tighten, had they seen it? and dismissed it as unimportant because treating it wouldn't bring miraculous results. She closed the laptop, overwhelmed and terrified. She wasn't supposed to know any of this. She wasn't supposed to question it. But how could she ignore what she saw? How could she watch a child suffer and pretend she didn't? At the end of the day, Emily tiptoed back to the sunroom one last time. Aaron was asleep on the couch, curled beneath a blue blanket, his small hand still resting near his ear, as if guarding it. The room was bathed in soft, warm lamplight, quiet and peaceful on the surface. But Emily felt something else beneath that quiet. Something urgent. Something waiting. She knelt beside him, brushing a stray hair from his forehead. In that moment, she realized something with absolute clarity. She was the only person in that entire mansion who saw Aaron as more than a diagnosis, more than a responsibility, more than a symbol for someone else's grief. She whispered a promise in a voice barely above breath, even though he couldn't hear it. I won't ignore this. Not anymore. And for a split second, she thought she saw him rest more easily. But deep inside Aaron's ear, the shadow continued to grow. The fourth night after Emily first noticed, the shadow brought a storm so violent that the entire Whitford estate trembled under the weight of thunder. Trees bent in the wind, lightning carved white scars across the sky, and rain hammered the windows like fists trying to break inside. Emily had always believed storms revealed truths people tried to hide, and inside the mansion, that belief was becoming literal. The air felt charged, almost electric, as if the house itself was bracing for something. She checked on Aaron twice before bedtime. Each time, she found him curled in his sheets, eyes open, face pale, hand pressed to his right ear. He didn't cry. He never made sound. But the agony in his expression was worse than any scream. Emily sat beside him until he fell asleep, though she doubted sleep would bring him peace. Downstairs, Maxwell paced in his study. The staff felt the tension through the walls. Mr. Whitford rarely showed his emotions openly, but tonight, fear leaked from him in small cracks. He had received another report from the tutor earlier that day. Aaron had refused to write, refused to participate, refused to focus on anything for longer than a few seconds. The tutor blamed behavior. Maxwell blamed exhaustion. Emily knew better. Pain had become the boy's constant shadow. She wanted to tell Maxwell again, to insist something was wrong, but the memory of his sharp reprimand still rang in her mind. She stood outside his study door for several minutes, her hand hovering near the wood, but she couldn't make herself knock. Not yet. The storm intensified as the clock approached midnight. Emily lay awake in a small bed, staring at the ceiling. She kept replaying the image of the dark shape inside Aaron's ear. What if it was growing? What if it was dangerous? What if every specialist had been wrong? The more she thought about it, the more her chest tightened. Her mind ricocheted through every medical article she had read the night before. Blockages that hardened over years. Congenital masses that expanded. Cysts that compressed nerves. Every possible explanation terrified her. She pressed a hand over her mouth to muffle a sob. She couldn't sleep. She couldn't rest. Not when a child she cared about was suffering alone upstairs. Just past 1 a.m, something pulled her from the bed. Instinct, or fear, or something deeper. She stepped into the hallway, lit only by the faint glow of emergencies. The mansion felt different at night, stripped of its elegance, revealing the cold machinery beneath. Emily moved silently toward the staircase, then froze when she saw a flicker of movement. A small figure stumbled out of the darkness at the far end of the hall. Aaron. His steps were uneven and slow, and his hand clutched the wall as if he were walking through water. Emily rushed toward him, her breath catching in her throat. When she reached him, he collapsed into her arms, trembling violently. Emily knelt, holding him steady. His face was contorted in pain far worse than she had ever seen. His free hand beat weakly against his chest, his sign for fear. She brushed his hair away from his forehead and saw fresh tears streaming down his cheeks. She signed quickly. "Where does it hurt?" He pressed his hand harder against his right ear. His mouth opened in a silent gasp, and his whole body tightened. Emily's pulse raced. Something inside him was reaching a breaking point. She stood and lifted him gently, carrying him down the hall, toward the lamplit area near the staircase where she could see better. When she tilted his head, the light hit his ear canal again, and what she saw made her heart stop. The mast had grown. It was no longer a faint shadow. It was a dark, compact obstruction deep inside, glistening unnaturally under the light. It didn't look like wax. It didn't look like anything she had ever seen. The sight made the room spin. How could doctors have missed this? How could something this large go unnoticed? Aaron whimpered and curled into her arms. Emily swallowed her terror and whispered against his hair, "I'm here. You're safe. I've got you." He couldn't hear her, but he felt her breath, her heartbeat, her steadiness. It was enough. A sharp sound cut through the air. Not thunder, but the crack of wood. Maxwell's study door flew open downstairs, and the sound of his cane echoed through the hall as he stormed toward them. Emily turned, shielding Aaron instinctively. Maxwell reached them in seconds, rainwater dripping from his coat as if he had just stepped outside. His face twisted when he saw the boy's condition. "What happened?" His voice shook, the fear unmistakable. Emily held Aaron closer. "He's in severe pain, sir. Worse than before." Maxwell leaned closer, studying the boy's trembling form. But when Emily started to tilt Aaron's head to show him the obstruction, Maxwell jerked back sharply. "Don't touch him like that," he snapped. "You are not qualified." Emily met his eyes, not defiant, but desperate. "Sir, you need to look. Please." But Maxwell couldn't bring himself to do it. He took Aaron from her arms, holding him awkwardly, almost fearfully, then turned away. "I'll call his doctor," he muttered. "We'll handle this properly." Emily stepped forward. "Sir, his specialists have missed something. I've seen it. It's there." Maxwell's hand tightened around the boy. His voice dropped into something cold and brittle. "Miss Carter, you are stepping out of your role." Emily felt tears burn her eyes. "With respect, sir, your role is the only thing keeping him in danger." For the first time, Maxwell faltered. His breath shook. His grip on Aaron loosened just slightly. But fear won. "Go to your room," he said. His voice was barely controlled. Now, Emily's throat closed. She wanted to scream. She wanted to shove him aside and pull Aaron back into her arms. But she couldn't risk frightening the boy further. She stepped backward, heart cracking with every step. When she reached the end of the hall, Maxwell carried Aaron toward the stairs, his movements quick and unsteady. Emily stood frozen for several seconds before finally running back to her room. She closed the door and covered her mouth to keep from crying out. Rain beat the windows. Thunder shook the walls. She wanted to call an ambulance. She wanted to break every rule, but she didn't know what Maxwell would do. He controlled everything in the estate. Phones, security, access. If she tried anything without permission, she could be thrown out, arrested, erased. But Aaron didn't have time for caution. Something inside him was escalating fast. Emily sank to the floor, shaking violently. She whispered the words she had spoken the night before, but this time they felt like a vow carved into stone. "If he cries again tonight, I don't care what the rules are. I'm going to help him." She pressed her hands together, mimicking Aaron's sign for safe. "I'll keep you safe! I promise." Outside, lightning flashed violently. Inside the estate, a truth pulsed quietly in the dark. The truth only Emily had seen, and soon she would be the only one brave enough to face it. Emily didn't remember falling asleep, only the jolt of terror when she woke to a sound she had never heard come from Aaron before. A faint, strangled gasp echoing down the hallway. She shot upright, her heart slamming into her ribs. The storm outside had faded into a distant rumble, but inside the mansion something much worse was building. Emily rushed into the hallway, her feet barely touching the carpet. At first, she saw nothing. Then she heard it again, Not a scream, not a cry, but a soft, choking noise, like someone trying to breathe through pain. She sprinted toward the source and found Aaron collapsed at the bottom of the stairs, clutching his right ear, rocking in agony. His mouth was open in a silent cry, his whole body trembling violently. Emily dropped to her knees and scooped him into her arms. His skin was cold, his forehead damp with sweat, his eyes wide with panic. He dug his fingers into his shirt, desperate for relief. Emily tried to stay steady, even as her pulse skyrocketed. "It's okay. I'm here," she whispered, knowing he couldn't hear her but hoping he could feel her certainty. She tilted his head gently toward the glow of the hallway lamp. What she saw made her stomach drop. The dark obstruction inside his ear had swollen, pressing dangerously against the inner canal. It was so large now that she could see it clearly, even without perfect light. No doctor could have missed this, not unless they weren't looking. She didn't think. She reacted. Emily lifted Aaron and rushed toward the nearest brightly lit area, the small sitting room near the foyer, where a single antique lamp cast warm light across a wooden table. She set him down carefully and grabbed a small emergency kit she had spotted in the room days early. During cleaning, Aaron's breath was shaky, uneven. His hand clawed at his own ear, and Emily had to gently pry it away so he wouldn't hurt himself. She knelt in front of him, her voice barely steady. "Aaron," she said slowly, "I need you to trust me." He blinked at her, terrified, but then his hands moved weakly, palms pressed together, his sign for safe. Emily swallowed the lump in her throat. "Okay," she whispered. "Okay. I'll help you." Her hands shook as she opened the kit. She found small tweezers, alcohol wipes, sterile cloth. She had never performed anything medical beyond basic first aid, but she had practiced calm her entire life. She could do this. She had to. Emily lifted his chin gently and moved closer. "Stay still," she breathed. Aaron nodded, his entire body rigid with fear. Emily took a long, deep breath and steadied the tweezers. She angled them carefully, slowly entering the ear canal. The obstruction was deep, sticky, and lodged in a way that made the angle difficult. Aaron winced and jerked slightly, and Emily froze, lowering her voice. "You're okay. You're okay. Just one more second." He nodded through tears. When the tweezers made contact with the mass, Emily felt it dense, foreign, wrong. She hooked the edge as gently as possible and pulled. Nothing. She pulled again, slow, controlled, careful. Aaron's hands trembled violently, but he stayed still, trusting her in a way that pierced her heart. On the third pull, something shifted. A suction-like slip. Then release. A dark, hardened mass slid free into her palm, wet and heavy like it had been growing inside him for years. Emily stared at it in disbelief, adrenaline roaring through her veins. But before she could react, Aaron gasped. A real gasp, audible. His hand flew to his ear. His eyes went wide, and he blinked rapidly as if seeing the world for the very first time. He sat up abruptly, breath shaking. His gaze shifted around the room in pure shock. Then he touched his throat, swallowed, and opened his mouth again. A small, broken sound came out, hoarse and unsteady, but unmistakably real. Emily's eyes filled with tears. "Aaron," she breathed. Can you hear something?" He looked at her, stunned, and nodded slowly. Then he flinched when the antique clock on the wall chimed a faint metallic click, a sound he had never heard until now. Footsteps thundered down the stairs. Emily turned just as Maxwell burst into the room, panic carved into every line of his face. Rainwater still clung to his coat. He must have been pacing outside, unable to sleep. When he saw Emily crouched on the floor with his grandson in her arms, his face contorted in rage. "What have you done?" he roared, storming forward. Emily barely had time to shield Aaron before Maxwell shoved her aside, grabbing the boy by the shoulders. "Aaron, look at me. Are you hurt?" "What did she do to you?" His voice boomed through the room, and Aaron flinched, not from fear, but from the sheer sound of it. For the first time in his life, His grandfather's voice was loud. Aaron lifted a trembling hand and touched Maxwell's chest. His lips moved. "Grandpa," he whispered. It was broken. It was fragile. But it was a word. Maxwell froze. His entire body went still, disbelief flooding his expression. "Say it again," he demanded, voice cracking. "Please, say it again." But before the miracle could fully reach him, he saw the mass in Emily's hand, saw the tweezers, saw the blood. His grief and fear twisted instantly into fury. He turned on her like a storm. "You could have killed him. You reckless!" "Sir," Emily cried, lifting the mass. This was inside him. This is why he was in pain. Maxwell didn't hear her, or maybe he refused to. Security guards appeared behind him, drawn by the shouting. "Remove her from the house," Maxwell ordered. "Right now." Aaron shrieked, a sharp, emotional noise that startled everyone, including himself. He reached desperately for Emily, tears spilling down his face. "No!" he cried. "No!" Maxwell stumbled backward, shaken by the sound of his grandson's voice, but still blinded by fear. The guards grabbed Emily, pulling her to her feet. "Let me explain," she begged. "Please, just listen." Maxwell pointed toward the door, trembling with rage. "Take her to the security office. Call the police." Dragged away, Emily locked eyes with Aaron one last time. "You're safe now," she mouthed, fighting tears. "You're going to be okay." Aaron sobbed harder, reaching toward her until Maxwell pulled him into his arms. The moment the door closed behind her, Maxwell faltered. Something inside him cracked. Hours later, after ambulance lights and doctors and tests and frantic analysis, Maxwell learned the truth, a truth that shattered him. A doctor showed him a medical file from 3 years earlier, a scan that had circled the obstruction, a recommendation for immediate removal, a note that had been ignored because ongoing treatment protocol brought in far more money. Maxwell stood in silence as guilt crushed him. His empire, his pride, his trust in specialists, all of it had kept Aaron deaf. Not fate, not genetics, negligence. He walked to the security office alone. Emily sat inside, exhausted and trembling. When Maxwell stepped into the doorway, he looked nothing like the untouchable magnate the world feared. He looked like a man who had broken apart and was trying to gather the pieces. He whispered her name, Emily. She stood slowly. "Sir, please let me." "EXPL don't," he said softly, voice thick with emotion. "Don't explain. Don't apologize. You saved him." His voice cracked. "And I nearly destroyed the only person who cared enough to see him. If you reached this moment, you've traveled through fear, hope, and the power of a single brave decision." Stories like this remind us that sometimes miracles come from unexpected people, and that paying attention can change a life. If you want more stories filled with mystery, emotion, and twists that hit deep, make sure to subscribe to the channel. Your support helps these stories reach more people, and it tells us you want to keep exploring these emotional journeys together. Thank you for watching, and thank you for feeling this story with us.